Hello, my name is Grace Carter, and I'm 30 years old. My life story isn't an easy one to tell, but I've learned that sometimes the toughest beginnings can lead to the strongest outcomes. Let me take you back to the day everything changed for me. I was just 14 years old when I lost my mother. She was my world, kind, strong, and always my biggest supporter. Her sudden death left a hole in my heart that no one could fill. I thought I still had my father, someone who would protect me during such a devastating time. But I was wrong. Within months of my mother's funeral, my father's true intentions surfaced. He remarried quickly, choosing his new life with his girlfriend over the life we had built as a family. One morning, he drove me to an unfamiliar building and left me there. It was an orphanage. "This is for your own good," he said before walking out the door, not even looking back. I stood there, stunned and heartbroken, watching him drive away. My world had crumbled yet again. I was angry, confused, and terrified of what would come next. But even in those dark moments, a small part of me refused to give up. I knew I had to survive, even if no one was going to help me. Life in the orphanage wasn't easy. The other kids had their own stories of heartbreak, and the caretakers did their best, but it wasn't home. I missed my mother every single day and couldn't understand how my father could abandon me so easily. Still, I refused to let my circumstances define me. I poured myself into my studies, knowing education might be my ticket to a better life. Unbeknownst to me, there was one person who hadn't forgotten about me, my grandfather. My father's father had always been a quiet, observant man, but he had a strong sense of justice. While he didn't openly oppose my father, he took a secretive and protective step that would change my life in ways I couldn't imagine. Years passed, and I learned to adapt to my new life. By the time I left the orphanage at 18, I was determined to carve out a future for myself. I worked hard, taking odd jobs and attending night classes, always pushing forward. What I didn't know was that my grandfather, even after his passing, had left me a lifeline, a gift of hope and security. My grandfather and I were never extremely close, but I remember him as a man of few words and great wisdom. He often sat quietly during family gatherings, observing rather than speaking. What I didn't realize was that he had seen through my father's selfishness long before I did. When my father abandoned me, my grandfather's quiet disapproval turned into action. By the time I turned 30, I had built a modest life for myself. I was working as a manager at a small logistics company in Chicago, living paycheck to paycheck but proud of my independence. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter from a lawyer's office. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Why would a lawyer be contacting me? Curiosity got the better of me, so I made an appointment to find out. The meeting changed everything. The lawyer introduced himself and explained that he had been tasked with handling my late grandfather's estate. "Your grandfather transferred all his property to you before his death," he said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "It was done in secret to ensure your father couldn't access it." I stared at the papers, unable to process what I was hearing. The property included a house in a quiet suburb, a significant amount of money, and shares in a few small companies. I could barely speak. Why didn't I know about this sooner? I finally managed to ask. The lawyer smiled gently. "Your grandfather wanted you to find out when you were old enough to use it wisely. He trusted that you would make something of yourself." The magnitude of his faith in me brought tears to my eyes. My grandfather had believed in me, even when I felt completely abandoned. He had safeguarded my future without me even knowing it. For the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of gratitude and connection to a family member who had truly cared about me. Armed with this newfound inheritance, I made a decision. I wasn't going to squander it. I had spent my life working hard to survive. Now, I would work hard to thrive. I would use this gift not only to build a better life but to honor the trust my grandfather had placed in me. The inheritance wasn't just money or property, it was an opportunity, a second chance to create a life I never thought possible. I sold the house my grandfather had left me and reinvested the money. It was a difficult decision, but I knew it was the right one. Every penny went towards starting my own logistics company, a dream I had nurtured for years. The beginning was rough. I worked long hours, sometimes questioning if I had made the right decision. But slowly, things started to fall into place. I hired a small but dedicated team, secured a few steady clients, and built my reputation for reliability and efficiency. Every time I faced a challenge, I thought about my grandfather. His quiet belief in me pushed me forward. As the years passed, the company grew beyond my expectations. By the time I turned 30, my business was thriving, and I had become a respected entrepreneur in Chicago. I had gone from living paycheck to having the financial stability and independence I had always dreamed of. But life has a way of bringing the past back to you when you least expect it. One evening, while attending a networking event, I noticed a man standing awkwardly by the door. His face was familiar, though it had aged and carried a heaviness I couldn't quite place. It was my father. The same man who had abandoned me all those years ago. For a moment, I froze, unsure how to react. He approached me hesitantly, as though testing whether I would recognize him. "Grace," he said softly, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. "Regret, perhaps?" "It's been a long time." "Yes, it has," I replied, my tone measured. I wasn't going to let emotions cloud my judgment, not after everything I had overcome. He looked at me with wide eyes, taking in my polished appearance and the confidence I now carried. "I've been hearing about you. You've done well for yourself," he said, almost as if he couldn't believe it. I wanted to say I'm proud of you." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Proud of me? This man, who had discarded me like an afterthought, now wanted to take credit for my success. I felt a surge of anger but quickly calmed myself. I wasn't that abandoned 14-year-old girl anymore. I was Grace Carter, strong, independent, and thriving despite him. "Thank you," I said simply, refusing to give him more than that. I wasn't here to mend broken relationships or seek his approval. My success was mine alone, built from the ashes of the life he had left behind. As the conversation ended, I walked away, leaving my father standing there, stunned and speechless. I didn't owe him anything, not an explanation, not forgiveness, and certainly not a place in my life. What I had built was mine, and it was all thanks to the silent strength and love of my grandfather. That night, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking out over the city lights. My journey had been long and painful, but it had shaped me into the person I was today. I was no longer defined by the abandonment of my past but by the resilience and determination that had carried me through. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel proud, not just of what I had achieved but of who I had become. After meeting my father, I realized something profound: closure doesn't always come from reconciliation. Sometimes, it comes from knowing that you've risen above the pain and forged a path for yourself. My encounter with him wasn't about proving anything to him, it was about affirming to myself that I was no longer the girl he left behind. As my business continued to grow, I made it my mission to give back. I thought about the struggles I faced in the orphanage and the challenges of starting from nothing. I decided to create a foundation to support young people in similar situations, helping them access education and resources to build their own futures. Naming it the Carter Foundation felt right, a tribute to my grandfather, whose belief in me had made all of this possible. My foundation started small, much like my business, but it quickly gained traction. Donations poured in from people who believed in the cause, and I began partnering with schools and community centers. The work was deeply fulfilling, and for the first time, I felt like I was repaying the kindness my grandfather had shown me. One day, while visiting one of the community centers supported by my foundation, I met a young girl named Mia. She reminded me of myself, quiet, determined, and carrying a sadness in her eyes that came from being abandoned by the people who were supposed to care for her. I sat down with her and listened to her story, offering her not just financial support but mentorship. Seeing her smile as she talked about her dreams was one of the most rewarding moments of my life. As I built my future, I decided to confront a piece of my past that I had avoided for years. I returned to the orphanage where I had spent my teenage years. Walking through its halls brought back a flood of memories, the loneliness, the small triumphs, and the resilience I had cultivated in those walls. I met some of the current residents, sharing my story with them in the hopes of inspiring them to see their potential. Your circumstances don't define you, I told them. What defines you is how you choose to rise above them. One of the most emotional steps in my journey was visiting my grandfather's grave. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I spoke aloud, as if he could hear me. Thank you, Grandpa, for believing in me when no one else did. Everything I've built is because of you. I hope I've made you proud. As I left the cemetery, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced before. My grandfather's love had been my foundation, and now, I was building a legacy that would honor his memory for years to come. At 30, I had achieved more than I ever thought possible, but my journey was far from over. I had built a thriving business, created a foundation to help others, and found strength in my independence. The pain of my past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it fueled my determination to live a life of purpose. As I looked out at the city skyline from my office one evening, I smiled to myself. My life had been filled with challenges, but I had overcome every single one. My grandfather's faith in me had lit a spark, and now that spark was a blazing fire. I was ready for whatever came next.